Want to finish signing in and come find a seat? Critical mass. How are we doing, Miguel? We're ready? Okay. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Marnie Zerbel, and I am your Research Facilities Coordinator. We have just a couple announcements before we get going. Thank you, everyone, for signing in if you're joining us in person. If you haven't done that, you can do that after the talk. Next week's seminar will be on Thursday, July 25th, when Franca Eichenberger, a postdoc in the Cetacean Conservation and Genomics Lab with MMI, will talk about their work with fine-scale spatial genetic structure, temporal stability, and breeding ground affiliation of humpback whales along the North Pacific West Coast, using an extensive database of DNA profiles collected over the last 3 decades. And a couple other quick things. If you're joining us online via Zoom and you have any questions, our tech KD will read them out after the talk. And for you lovely folks who are joining us here in person, thank you. And if you have any questions, I'll bring you the mic after the talk. So to get started, let me introduce our speaker this evening. Will White is an associate professor with the Department of Fisheries, Wildlife, and Conservation Sciences, and he's part of Coombs here at OSU. He got his BS in biology at Davidson College in North Carolina, his PhD in ecology, evolution, and marine biology at UC Santa Barbara. And he's been here at OSU since 2017 and is a quantitative fisheries ecologist who links models to data to understand ecological mechanisms and inform management. And his current research focus includes the adaptive management of marine protected areas and strategies to enhance resilience of marine ecosystems and fisheries to climate change. Students in Will's lab work on a wide range of systems, including zooplankton, my favorite, kelp, groundfish, and sea turtles. And take it away, Will.
Great, thank you. And whales too, I'm sorry. Also, I have a student who works on whales. Totally forgot. So yes, thanks everybody for coming, and thanks to those of you who are joining us online. So I'll be talking today about marine reserves. Right? These are places in the ocean that we've set aside for protection. You typically can't fish there. You can't do any kind of development or mineral extraction. They're just protected parts of the ocean. And okay, so why do we care about those? Well, they're in the news quite a bit right now. So back in 2022, an international treaty was signed with the signatory nations committing to set aside 30% of the global ocean by 2030. This is part of the 30 by 30 initiative. The US didn't sign that treaty, but President Biden at least has committed to that same 30 by 30 goal, and some states have also committed to that. So that's quite a large amount of the ocean to be set aside for protection. Here in Oregon, also in the news recently, has been our system of 5 marine reserves up and down the coast. They've been in the news recently because their regulations were finalized back in 2012. And so in 2022, the Department of Fish and Wildlife put together a report evaluating the first 10 years of the Marine Reserve Program. And my research group was part of the state legislative mandated university review of that report. And we made recommendations to the state legislature to continue the commitment to the Oregon Marine Reserves Program. And so a law, House Bill 4132, was signed just this spring that gives additional funding to the Marine Reserves Program and continues that program here in Oregon. So there's a lot of interest in marine reserves as a conservation tool. So that leads us to ask, what do we want them to do? What are the conservation outcomes we're looking for from marine reserves? And historically, there have really been 2. The first is that we want to protect the habitat inside that location, with the hopes that by protecting habitat, we're also conserving biodiversity. We're allowing for more diverse species to exist in more pristine habitats. And by not fishing, we're expecting that there will be more fish and that those fish will live longer and be bigger. And sure enough, that's basically what we find that happens inside marine reserves. So this is a figure that I think I show at the beginning of all my talks, so forgive me if you've seen it before. But this is a figure taken from a global meta-analysis that Sarah Lester and colleagues did back in 2009, where they analyzed data that had been published from either inside and outside marine reserves or before the reserve was put into place and after, and looked at the ratio of different biological measures inside and outside. And so that ratio is what's on the vertical axis. And so you can see that the majority of cases you have more biomass, more abundance, more population density of fish and invertebrates, bigger animals inside the reserves, and greater species richness. So there's some exceptions in the red where things didn't work out. But on average, that's what happens. However, in the past maybe 10 years or so, increasingly people want some other benefits to be happening inside marine reserves. And there's interest in whether they can also provide resilience against climate change and climate-related disturbances, right? So we're thinking about things like the marine heat wave that struck the Pacific coast about 10 years ago and caused huge changes to the marine communities here and marine fisheries. Maybe protecting things in reserves could lend some resistance and some resilience to systems that are facing climate change and climate-related disturbances. And there's some evidence that that could happen. So there's a really now quite famous paper that was published back in 2012, led by Fiona Kelly down at Stanford, where they found that when a hypoxic-related mortality event happened to populations of abalones down in Baja California, the population that was inside a marine reserve had more and larger abalone and had lower mortality during the hypoxic event than populations outside. So the reserve protected the abalone population, or the abalone in the reserve were more resistant to the disturbance. And then by spawning those large adult abalone, the spawned larvae sort of recolonized the disturbed populations. So there was resilience happening, there was a recovery. That's one example, but that's not by any means the universal case. So a study came out just this year down in California, finding that during that 2014 to 2016 heat wave, populations and communities of rocky reefs and kelp forests and intertidal systems down in California experienced exactly the same type of community shift and changes in community structure, both inside and outside reserves. So there was no resilience benefit to that type of a disturbance in those reserves. And to get these are just anecdotes, to get a more global perspective, Julia Giacomo published this paper in 2022. This was also a global meta-analysis, but looking at a different set of reserve outcomes. And they categorized a number of different possible things that reserves could do. If we're thinking about resilience to disturbances, the one that we're most often thinking about is what they call stability, which is right here, which just means that populations and ecosystems are staying relatively constant despite a fluctuating environment. And you can see that they only found 4 studies that actually examined whether reserves could provide that type of benefit or not, right? So it's a difficult thing to study, and there's really mixed evidence. What my colleagues and I have been starting to suggest is that in order to talk about resilience in a more concrete way, we need to get more realistic about the mechanisms by which reserves could confer resilience. Okay, so there's a lot of hope and a lot of advocacy surrounding the idea that we need to have reserves in order to protect against climate change, but we need to be realistic in setting expectations. Okay, and so I was part of a working group that produced a report for the state of California on this topic a few years ago, and then I was a co-convener of a symposium at the International Marine Protected Area Congress back in 2023, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the ideas that came out of those working groups related to climate resilience. Okay, so first, in order to really be precise in our language, we have to define what we mean by resilience. Okay, and typically we have defined resilience as ecologists. We've defined resilience in sort of what I call a state-based fashion, where we're thinking about the state of a system, population abundance or population biomass, and how that changes when faced with an environmental perturbation. Okay, so that could be the response to a single perturbation, and then we'd be interested in how much does the population decrease, and then how quickly does it come back. That's often called engineering resilience because it's almost like we're thinking about a machine or an object being subjected to stress and then responding to that stress. Or we could think about a population or a community or an ecosystem that's being subjected to ongoing disturbances, and we want to know how well does it maintain a positive state? Does it go extinct or does it stay at a positive abundance? And so that's looking at long-term variability, and we talk about that type of resilience as ecological resilience. Now, the problem with defining things in this way is that it's really hard to measure whether a particular system is resilient by either definition, right? You either have to wait for some disturbance to happen. It's not like we're going to go out and create a heat wave and try to destroy things, right? So you have to wait for something to happen and then happen to have been measuring things beforehand and then measure things afterwards to see how well the system responded. Even then, it's very difficult to construct a counterfactual. What would have the event been like if there hadn't been a marine reserve there, right? Likewise, for the second definition, you need to have a really long time series in order to assess that. So in order to get around those sort of conceptual problems, we propose that we should think instead about the mechanisms of resilience and what marine reserves could do to a natural system that would lead to better resilience. Okay, so for example, one really concrete thing that we know happens in marine reserves is that we get older and larger individuals. You get bigger fish, right? So we can ask, is there evidence that that happens? Yes, there's great evidence for that. What's the mechanism by which that would lead to resilience? Well, if you have older and larger fish, you'll have much more reproduction happening in the population. And so you should be able to be more resistant to any kind of disturbance that affects new recruits, right? So if you have a recruitment failure during a heat wave because all the larvae died, you have lots of adults in the population to make more recruits the next year, right? Is there evidence that that can happen? There's mixed evidence. So I'm giving that a yellow thumbs up there. And can we measure that? Yeah, you just have to go out and count the fish and measure them. And you can see whether one population has a fuller size structure than another. So that's a much more concrete way of assessing that effect, both making a prediction for what you think is going to happen and measuring whether you think it's going to happen. We can do this for other types of effects too. So for example, you might expect that reserves would have more biogenic habitat, more kelp, right? So potentially we're protecting predators of sea urchins and suppressing trophic cascades so that you have more kelp habitat. There's some evidence for that in some reserve systems. What's the benefit of that? Well, you might have more buffering of physical disturbances like storm surge. Is there evidence that that happens? Yes, in some systems you have that evidence as well. And how would you monitor that? You just go out and count the habitat. This is not quite as simple for other hypothesized benefits of reserves. So for example, one proposed benefit is that animals that are inside protected areas have better physiological condition. They're less stressed because they're not around people and there's no fishing happening. There's some evidence for that. And then the idea would be that those better conditioned animals would be more resistant to physiological stresses like higher temperatures or low oxygen. There's some evidence for that, but that's a difficult thing to measure. So maybe this is a more challenging way of having resilience that we need to grapple with, right? There are other hypothesized benefits like improved larval connectivity between reserves and a network that might make it easier for range shifting species. Species that are moving poleward because of warming waters might move through that reserve system more easily. Is there evidence for that? Not really, it's just hypothesized, and larval things are hard to measure, so that's a really difficult thing to assess, okay? So our proposal is that we should be concrete in predicting what the reserves should do and how we're gonna actually assess whether those predictions come true or not. And so you can do this for a whole long list of different potential effects of reserves at different levels of biological organization, from individuals to organisms to populations. And the idea would be that by thinking about resilience in that very mechanistic way, we can slot that into an adaptive management framework where we can make predictions about what we think is going to happen. We can then monitor to see whether the reserve is realizing those potential goals. And then by comparing observations to predictions, we can make adjustments to the system to achieve the resilience mechanisms that we hope to achieve without having to wait for another heat wave to come along to see whether we were right. So, and this is all on a paper that I'm expecting to get a decision on any day now for a special issue in marine policy. So there's some outstanding issues here, though. The first is that we have some uncertainty about whether some of those proposed mechanisms could actually have the desired effect. There's also it's not clear from the work that's been done so far, whether benefits that happen inside the reserve can sort of spill over and provide resilience in a variety of different ways to the rest of the population, to the part that's exposed to fishing. And so what I'm going to talk about for the rest of today is two different examples of using population models to set expectations for what type of resilience benefits we could experience in reserves. Okay, and so we have our two different ways of defining resilience, and I'm going to start by talking about the first one, just the response to a single perturbation. Okay, so we want to think about a population that experiences some pulse disturbance, and I keep using the heat wave example, but it's a really good one. And so, for example, we could think about a species like Pacific cod that during the heat wave experienced a pretty serious recruitment failure. There was a reduction in their spawning habitat, and larvae had higher mortality rates, and so they had much reduced recruitment for those years, and that had an effect on the population. So you can imagine a population that's sort of bopping along, and then you have some number of years of disturbance, that's in the gray bar, the population declines and it recovers. And so the two response variables we'll be thinking about are the magnitude of that impact and then the return time, okay? And I should say, I'm pretty sure that this picture was taken here at the Alaska Fisheries Science Center. All right, so we simulated the dynamics of a sort of generic groundfish population. I'm going to use population parameters for blue rockfish in the examples that I show here, and then sort of extend that to more species. And so what we're going to see is a few different examples of what happens when you have some level of reduction in larval survival for some number of years, and then the response. And so here, I've just got the same fish population parameters, but a range of different levels of disturbance from 10% reduction in larval survival to 50%. And so, of course, the more you kill them, the more impact there is and the longer it takes to respond. We could also ask what happens when you vary the duration of the response, and of course it makes things worse. But more interestingly, you can vary the life history of the species and ask how that affects things. And so if we have everything's the same except for 3 different mortality rates of the fish itself. So if M is the natural mortality rate, if you increase that by 50%, what you do is you have a shorter lived fish. So it has fewer old animals, which means that those young age classes that are being affected make up a bigger proportion of the population. So you have a bigger impact just because it's a shorter lived fish, but then it recovers faster because it takes less time to fill in all the age classes once the disturbance stops. Okay, so sort of faster living species should be more affected, but should recover faster. And then the second thing I wanted to show you is all the same results, but expressed in terms of biomass instead of abundance. So not numbers of fish, but the biomass of fish. And the effect that has, patterns are all the same, but they're all shifted in time to the right? And that's because it takes time for animals to accumulate large biomass. Those early age classes don't represent a lot of the biomass of the population. And so the effect of the disturbance isn't felt for several years when those larvae would have been larger fish. Okay, so those effects should be shifted in time. Right. So then we can summarize all this by plotting those two response variables, right? The impact, so good is over here and bad is over here, and the recovery time up here in years, right? And so each one of these dots is a different species experiencing a different level of disturbance. And this is a range of, I think, 17 different, basically rockfish species. So sort of near shore groundfish from the Pacific coast. So they have all different life history parameters and everything. And so basically, if you're down in this corner, you have a lot of resilience. And if you're up in this corner, you don't. And the dots are 3 different levels of disturbance from low to high. And I've ordered these species, even though they have all different growth rates and everything. The most important thing is their natural mortality rate, essentially how long do they live. And so we have low natural mortality, long-lived species up here, and short-lived species down here. And so you can see that general pattern that if you're long-lived, then the impact isn't very great, but the recovery time is slow. And if you're short-lived, then you expect to have a higher impact, but you recover faster. Okay, what does that do when we toss in fishing into the mix? Well, the effect of fishing is basically to shorten the fish's lifespan. They don't live as long. So here I've plotted just one species and one level of disturbance, but different levels of fishing, from no fishing or very, very little fishing in yellow up to red. And you can see that you make the impact greater because those larvae have a bigger proportion of the population. And if it's a closed, demographically closed population, so all the reproduction's happening internal to that population, the recovery time is much slower because you're missing a lot of reproduction in the population. If there's open recruitment, so all the recruitment to the population is coming from reproduction happening elsewhere and larvae disperse in, then fishing actually shortens the recovery time because you're not missing out on any reproduction and you have less of the age structure to fill in to get back to where you were. Okay, so the implication of all this is that because there's no fishing in them, reserves would have greater resilience to impacts like this, to the loss of recruitment due to disturbances. So then we wanted to ask, well, what about the second definition of resilience, this resistance to ongoing perturbations? And what are the implications for the entire coastal population, right? If the whole coastline is experiencing a disturbance, does having a reserve help buffer the whole system against variability? Because of course, reproduction that happens in, spawned larvae that happens in the reserve can disperse to the fished area and help recolonize the fished area after a disturbance. And we wanted to ask, what's the effect not just on the biomass of the system, but fishery yields? Okay, can having a reserve actually benefit the fishery by smoothing out variability? Okay, so why would we think that being in a reserve would lead to less variability in the face of environmental fluctuations? And the basic reason is that we know that fishing a system increases the amount of variability in the system. This has been shown empirically by analyzing things like the cow-coffee data set, but it can also be shown mathematically. And the basic reason for that is that most fish populations can be described with what we call a stock-recruit relationship or an egg-recruit relationship. And so if we just focus on this box right here in this figure, if we plot the egg production of the population on this axis and the resulting recruitment, the number of young animals that move into the population in the next year, there's usually a sort of saturating nonlinear relationship, okay? So basically, at high levels of egg production, there's competition of some sort, and there's sort of a maximum number of new recruits that can enter the population, regardless of how many eggs you make. And so in a lightly fished population, if you have a lot of variability in egg production, that all gets smoothed out because for a wide range of numbers of eggs coming into this relationship up here, you get a narrow range of possible recruits. Okay, so an unfished population would tend to buffer out variability, especially variability in recruitment. But if you have been fishing, if you have a heavily fished population, egg production isn't over here, egg production decreases because you have lower survival and the adults aren't living as long and aren't making as many eggs. And so we'd be more on this linear part of the curve. And so that's in this panel over here. And so if you have a lot of variability in egg production, that translates into a lot of variability because there's no smoothing out of that nonlinear relationship. Okay, so we expect fish populations to be a lot more variable because of that, and also just because as you fish a population, you compress the age structure. There's fewer and fewer old animals. And so that means, and that's shown in this figure here, what this is the distribution of when reproduction happens over the life of a fish. So young fish don't reproduce at all because they're not sexually mature. You get a lot of reproduction in sort of middle-aged fish, and then because few fish survive to really old ages, there's less reproduction happening in those old ages. If you fish a population, you eliminate those really old fish, and so you compress all the reproduction into just a few ages. And that can amplify variability because essentially, if you have one really good year with a lot of recruits, they will then all begin reproduction at the same time, and you'll get another big pulse of recruits, like one generation time afterwards. And so you tend to get these sort of generational cycles that we call sort of a echo effect or cohort resonance, because you get big pulses echoing through the population. And so it's more variable than a population where reproduction is spread out over many, many ages. So we would expect that putting a population in a reserve would reduce both of those effects and make things smooth out. Okay, so to ask how that works in a system with a fished part of the population and an unfished reserve, we used a spatial population model. So we're assuming that there's a fished part and an unfished part, and that larvae produced in either part can go back and forth. So they share reproduction, essentially, we assume that there is environmental variability in the survival of larvae. And we thought about the two things that managers might be able to do to reduce variability in the system. They can change the harvest rate, which we abbreviate with F, the fishing mortality rate, or they can change the amount of area that's in marine reserves. So we're going to look at those two sort of management levers. And as a response, we're going to ask about variability in two different ways. We're going to think about how much time over, say, 50 years or 100 years does the population spend below some undesirable level, okay? So for example, in fisheries management, we might think of maximum sustainable yield as a limit. We don't want to be fishing at a rate that's higher than the rate that gives you the maximum sustainable yield. So we might ask, well, how long does biomass fall below the level that it would be if you were fishing at maximum sustainable yield? That's called BMSY. So we're going to ask, how long is biomass below that level? So imagine that's that target level. We're going to ask, how many years are you in the gray here, right? And similarly, for fisheries yield, we're going to ask, how much time do you spend falling below some reference level of fisheries yield? And we just picked MSY for that as well. Okay, so the results of this boil down to these two figures. And what I'm showing you here are those two management tools, right? So the proportion of the coastline that's in a marine reserve and the harvest rate. And the harvest rate I've expressed relative to the harvest rate that gives you the maximum sustainable yield. And that's 1. And so that's where that dotted white line is. You can think of that as if you're below the white line, we're fishing sustainably. And if we're above the white line, we're overfishing, okay? And then what we've plotted in these two panels is the fraction of time that many, many thousand model simulations spent below those reference levels, okay? So it's biomass of the entire coastline on the left and fishery yield on the right. And so yellow is good in these plots and blue is bad. And so what we want to look for is pick any spot on the graph, and as you move from left to right, so as you add reserve area, do you go from blue to yellow? That means that making more of the coastline in reserves is giving you a benefit in terms of reduced variability or resilience, right? And so in terms of biomass, you can see that if you're not fishing very much, the biomass is not very variable at all. So it's only when you get up to pretty high fishing rates that you see more blue. But sure enough, for any of these higher fishing rates, going from left to right moves you to the yellow. So adding reserves would buffer variability in biomass. The same is not true for fishery yield, though. Okay, so not surprisingly, we get fishery yields spending time above MSY right when we're fishing right about at MSY, so in this area. But adding reserve area moves you to the blue for almost this entire chart, meaning that reserves are actually increasing variability in yield and causing you to spend more time below that target level rather than decreasing variability in yield, except for this area in the red box up here where we are moving from darker colors to lighter colors. So that means that we're getting a benefit of reserves for fisheries, but only when we're overfishing, which is consistent with other things we know about the way reserves work, that you only increase average yields as well when you're over harvesting. That's the only time that spillover from a reserve can benefit the fishery. Okay, so the results: can reserves buffer against environmental perturbations? Well, we do get faster recovery from a single disturbance event. We should have less variability in biomass, and there can be less variable fisheries benefits, but only under those really narrow conditions, okay? So we can use these kind of things to set expectations for what we think reserves could do, so we don't sort of overpromise that. But these are just expectations and predictions. We want to also be able to monitor reserves to see if we can detect some of these changes. And so I want to spend the last part of my talk talking about the way we assess reserve effects. So the typical way that we measure what's happening in reserves goes back to the science of detecting ecological impacts, okay? So let's say we have a field or a forest and we pave it with a road, and we want to see what the effect is on the forest ecosystem. And there are a few different ways we could do that. So starting at the bottom, you could just have a control area and then the impacted area. See, there's this road going through the tree. Imagine these are trees. So you have a control and the impact. So it's sort of inside, outside in the reserve context. You could do before, after, right? If you have data beforehand, you can see how the change affects things. Or you could do both, what's called a before-after control impact, or a BACI kind of design, where you compare the control and the reference site both beforehand and afterwards to see if a difference has been created between them. Okay, the trick with marine reserves is that marine reserves are not a simple experiment like putting a road through a forest, because reserves are dynamically linked to the fish part of the population, right? You have larval connectivity, you have fish moving, and so there can be spillover from the reserve into the fished area. That could affect your comparisons. You can also have the fishing that was happening in the marine reserve might now also move to the fished area. So by virtue of creating the fished area, you've also changed what's happening in the control part of the population. And there can be other sort of broader scale impacts. What if you have a lot of fishermen decide just to leave the system completely because it's too hard to fish now that there's a reserve? Well, that's going to change the both areas as well. Okay, so we have to account for those sort of things. And so we wanted to ask, how do these different measures of how reserves work operate in a marine reserve context? Which you'd think somebody would have done this already, but apparently not. And so what we did is we built the same kind of model I've been talking about, a model where you have a fished area and a marine reserve. So it's a reference site and the fished area. And we are modeling the population dynamics of a rockfish. They're connected by larval dispersal. And we're assuming that there's variability in the rockfish population dynamics and that there's measurement error in counting fish. And so we simulate a bunch of different population dynamics where there's a reference site that doesn't really change but has fluctuations. And then there's the reserve site labeled as marine protected area here that increases in abundance over time. And we're going to sample it or simulate sampling it both inside and outside and before after. Okay, so we're going to look at, sorry, my daughter is calling me. We're going to look at what those different ways of measuring reserve effects looks like. And so what I'm going to show you is a bunch of panels that look like this, where on the x-axis, sorry, you can't see it here, are years after the reserve goes in, and then the logarithm of that response ratio. So either inside-outside ratio, before-after ratio, or the inside-outside before and after. Okay, and in the little inset, I'm going to show you what the average conditions are. So the reference in blue is just staying constant, and the reserve is increasing. Okay, so in our sort of baseline scenario, all three ways of measuring this, so before, after, inside, outside, and backy, all give us basically the same answer, so that's cool. If, however, we simulate that fishery squeeze, where all the fishing that was happening inside the reserve goes into the fished area, then we start to get different answers, where the before-after is a little more, is not showing as big of an effect size as other ways of measuring it. And then, somewhat more alarmingly, if we simulate a case where the population overall is declining, and even adding a marine reserve doesn't make it go up, but it continues to decline, then you get really different answers, where the inside, outside, and the backy both give a really positive response, right? Because even though it's going down, there's still more fish in the reserve, but the before-after comparison on its own says, oh, look, things are declining, that's bad. These are all for sort of open population dynamics where all the larvae are raining in from outside, but you get exactly the same answer if it's a closed system. So this is a little bit troubling, especially because if you look at global meta-analyses like the one I showed you at the beginning of the talk, most of the comparisons are just inside-outside because nobody was around to collect data before the reserve went into place. And so we were wondering, in the context of that type of study, does it matter the way that you were measuring your response ratio, and does that affect our understanding of sort of the global effect of marine reserves? Right, so this is basically the same figure I showed you before from 2009. We wanted to go through and sort of ask, do you get different answers depending on the way you measured it? Unfortunately, Lester and colleagues didn't separate out in their data which type of measurement they were doing. They put it all together. And when we reached out to Sarah to ask if she still had the original data files from her paper, she was like, yeah, they're on a hard drive someplace and I can't find them. So we said, okay, well, let's just sort of try to update that analysis and move forward to see what's happened since 2009. So we followed the same basic procedures that Lester had done, but starting when they ended their data collection in 2006 and going up to June of 2020, when we started our study. And we didn't pool across species, so we separated everything out by species, and we also kept track of whether they were harvested or not, and also what type of a comparison it is, whether it's inside, outside, or before, after, or the full backy. And I'm going to ask you to excuse me just 1 second. So we ended up with 82 different studies and about 700 different individual species observations. And then we calculated those response ratios. And because we couldn't pool our data set with the older data set because we didn't have the original data files, and we just didn't want to go back and have to redo all that work. So what we did is we took a Bayesian approach. So we used the Lester response ratios as the prior expectation for what we were going to find. And then we updated that with all the new data post 2006 to get a posterior estimate of what those response ratios are. Okay. So, and we did all this. This was a project that we started in the summer of 2020. I don't know if you guys remember the summer of 2020, but this is when we were all working from home and we were all bored and depressed. And I decided that our lab group should just get together and do a project together. And so that's what we did. This is a photo from sometime in like July of 2020. You can see I've got like a COVID haircut going on there. But we were meeting over Zoom and getting this all done and all sort of taking our own time to do this project. This is actually a project that I had conceived of with Carrie Nichols, who was a longtime colleague. That's her pug, David Bowie, I think. That might be Pixel, but I think it's David Bowie. And we had conceived of this back in like 2014, but just didn't get it done. So it was a positive outcome of the pandemic was that we actually completed this project. And so I'm just going to skip ahead and show you the results. So this is a Bayesian posterior. So this is a probability distribution of what that expected response ratio is. Okay, and so this is overall. If it's 0, that means there's no effect of marine reserves. If we're positive, that means there's a positive effect. And so this is just for abundance so the number of fish. So you get more fish inside a reserve, although you can see there's quite a bit of uncertainty in that. And a lot of that probability distribution is to the left, indicating that it's, on average positive, but variable. And if we split this out by the way we're counting things, we also get different answers. So we've got before, after, inside, outside, and backy. And remember, our expectation was that doing a before-after comparison might give you a smaller effect size, and because it's going to be capturing better the long-term trends, which could be negative. And sure enough, that's what we found. And so here, the red is for harvested species, and the blue is for species that are not affected by fishing. And so, like you'd expect, there's almost no effect of the reserves on the unfished species. These are all very close to 0. Positive effects on the fished species, but a bigger effect when you measure it as an inside-outside ratio than when you measure it as a before-after ratio. And again, that's a little bit troubling because if you look at the breakdown of the data, there's many, many more inside-outside comparisons than the other two types. And this paper is going to be online any day now. It just got accepted a couple of weeks ago. Okay, and then the last thing I want to mention that's related to this idea of the way we measure things is really important is that what happens when you've put a reserve into place, and then as you're waiting and accumulating data to measure to see if you have a positive effect of the reserve, if you get a disturbance during that waiting period, right? So if you have a fish, if you've put the reserve into place and biomass begins to increase, but then you have some kind of climate disturbance, and things go way down, and this is the time period when you were going to make your assessment of what's happening, you can see that that disturbance has reduced the difference between the fish population and the reserve population relative to where it would be if the disturbance hadn't happened. Okay, and this is super relevant to us here on the West Coast, both in Oregon and in California. We had this sort of 10-year decision period where we were assessing the effects of reserves that had gone into place in sort of the 2009 to 2012 time period. Those reserves had gone into place, and then we had the heat wave that really changed the ecosystem right before we were going to measure to see if they were successful. And so what we did, I'm not going to show you all the data. I'm just going to show this really nice graphical abstract that Jess Hopf made. Basically, same kind of simulations, but adding in this kind of disturbance. And we found that that can delay the detection of reserve effects for up to 10 years following the disturbance. And that delay was longer actually for the before-after type of comparison than for the other two. Okay, so what are the take-homes from today? The first is that our predictions and our monitoring when we're thinking about climate resilience and marine reserves should be focused on really mechanisms and really specific predictions, right? Not all reserves and not all ecosystems have the same possible mechanisms, right? For example, in the context of kelp forests, we often want populations in reserves to have more healthy kelp forests because we're protecting the predators of sea urchins. Well, it turns out in Southern California, there are fish that are fished for that are important predators of sea urchins. And so you find that reserves have healthier and more resilient kelp forests. In Oregon, we don't have a fishery for any of the things that attack sea urchins. And so we don't necessarily expect the same type of response in our kelp forests, right? It's also the case that we can't really expect a lot of benefits for the fish part of the population from reserves unless we're already overfishing, which is a goal we're trying to avoid anyway, right? So we can't make big promises about fishery benefits. And then also, it's important to make sure that we are aware of the fact that different ways of monitoring and different ways of handling monitoring data will give different answers. And so having before-after data and having time series data can be much more informative than just a single snapshot, or even in some cases than doing a before-after control impact comparison. And then finally, as I just showed you, globally, marine reserves are having positive conservation outcomes, but those benefits might be smaller or more uncertain at a global average scale than we might have thought beforehand. Okay, so the recommendation and the thing I want you to take away is that we want to make sure that we consider ecological findings in light of the theoretical expectations for how big of an effect we can expect to see. So what's next? I just want to sort of give you a preview of work that's going on in this space going forward. We've been thinking a lot about climate variability and climate impacts, and oceanographers are building capacity to make forecasts into the future of what's happening along our coastline, right? So we have global climate models that we can downscale to make spatially realistic predictions of what's going to be happening over the next several decades at a spatial scale that's relevant to marine reserves. So we can say, oh, look, there's potential hotspots that are going to experience more hypoxia or more warming. And oh, over here, there might be more refugia, right? So we have those forecasts, and the question is, what do we do with that information? How should management respond? And so right now, we're in the midst of developing what we call a management strategy evaluation, where we simulate what's going to be happening to populations going forward, given those climate impacts, simulate different management tools. For example, what if we wanted to move a marine reserve into a place that's going to be less affected by climate change? Or what if we can forecast that a heat wave is coming? Do we want to temporarily close the fishery? Or do we want to undertake some kelp restoration before the heat wave happens? That sort of thing. So we're experimenting with simulating those different management tools, simulating the observations that we would make that would be early warning factors telling us to take those management steps. And figure out what do we do with these climate forecasts. So that's work that's going on now that maybe I'll talk to you about again in a year or so. And with that, I want to thank you. Almost all the work I showed you was done in collaboration with Jess Hopp, who's a research associate in my group who lives in Australia, but I also have many, many collaborators who contributed to all these things. And so I've sort of grouped them by the different projects they were on. I see Karen in the audience. She was an awesome part of the meta-analysis project. And thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, awesome talk. We've come a long way since Jane Lubchenko's big old fat female hypothesis 20 years ago. Do we have any questions online yet? All right. Well, then anyone in the room here? Question? All right.
Great presentation, Will. I just had a question. It seemed like on the for time on the x-axis, it wasn't necessarily defined. Is that like set up like every year surveying, like a data point for every year?
Sorry, which one are we talking about?
Or just anytime there was time on the
oh yeah, usually that was
more broadly, just like through time.
Yeah, generally through time we're thinking about things on like a 20-year timeline is usually
Yeah.
the,
Are you,
the scale
I
of
guess
that.
like for the frequency of sampling, as someone who samples our marine reserves,
Yes.
is it like expecting every, would you expect different things with a sample every year versus a sample every 2 years?
Right.
That's
Okay.
kind of what
So
I'm getting at.
yeah, I got you now. That's a great question. What this is, the scenario this is simulating essentially is that you sampled at the beginning to get your before, and then you have just one sample in one of these years. So what if you did your after at 10 years, or what if you did your after at 20 years? Not accounting for any sort of intervening sampling. And that's because in the context of that meta-analysis, that's mostly what we had, is we had sort of a before and then some time after. We have an undergraduate in the lab working right now on the subset of studies that did have a time series to look and see what that time series result gives us. Yeah. But yeah, more data is usually better, so time series are always helpful. You know, that would be less of a problem in this context too, right? If you could see what happened before and after that disturbance, that would contextualize the result.
Hi, can you talk more about the marine heat wave and what was the change in sea surface temperature and what do you think caused it?
Yes, give me a second. So the marine heat wave was primarily driven, so circulation in the Northeast Pacific Ocean, right, is driven by atmospheric forces, right? So we have the Aleutian Low Pressure Center that sets up over the Aleutian Islands, is in a large part responsible for the cool waters that we typically get in the summertime, and the northerly winds that blow along the coast and cause coastal upwelling and things like that. What happened in 2014 is that because of variability in the jet stream and upper circulation in the air, we got a really strong high pressure center over the Gulf of Alaska that heated up the Gulf of Alaska more than it should have been. And that pool of warm water sort of changed the circulation of the rest of that part of the Pacific Ocean. And so you get that warm water sort of pooling down along the West Coast. Because there was that high pressure in the atmosphere, we also didn't get as much of the wind, the northerly wind along the coast here. So we didn't get as much overturning and upwelling that would typically cool those waters. At the same time, an El Nino started down in the tropics. So you had warm water coming up from the tropical East Pacific that also sort of joined in with what we call the blob of warm water that formed in the Gulf of Alaska. I could not tell you off the top of my head what the change in temperature was, but it was a few degrees warmer than normal. And really fundamentally changed the zooplankton, the phytoplankton productivity in the ocean. It changed the mix of species that we had. So there are a lot of tropical species that started showing up in waters here. And when those kind of things happen, and we had a lot of tropical Central Pacific species come closer to shore. So like bluefin tuna and albacore came closer to shore. So it changed the food web, it changed productivity. It was bad news for salmon because the copepods that they rely on weren't as present and weren't as productive. And that persisted longer than we'd expect. So persisted for about 3 years. Primarily, that persistence was primarily driven by the El Nino being present in the second half of that. Yeah.
Can you explain why you see much different results between the before and after and the Backy, even though before and after is part of Backy?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think the result depends on the difference between that difference being greater than the difference before and after, essentially. So if you could imagine a scenario where the Backy gives a slightly different result, depending on how much of how steep that decline is. And so this is meant to be just an example of one possible outcome and how you could get that difference. But yeah, we got the result and we're like, that's really interesting. And then we had the same question, like, wait a minute, Backy's supposed to fix that problem. And it's really because of the relative magnitude of the reserve effect relative to the decline effect. all the way up.
Thanks. Thanks, Will. That was a great talk. I think I'd be interested in digging in a little bit on one of your key takeaways, which was that you would only expect fishery benefits to accrue if there is already overfishing occurring. And as you noted, there's a lot of effort to make sure that overfishing doesn't happen. I think my first reaction was, oh, feels like there's a big caveat to that, that the benefits you're talking about in that statement are just maybe short-term yield.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm interested in your response to that. I think there may be some other benefits that are more nebulous, probably more difficult to measure, but certainly worth consideration in the bigger context of thinking about.
Yeah, that's a great question, Maggie. Thank you. And so it's important to know, to sort of define what we're talking about. And so the types of benefits, when I use that word, I mean a net benefit, right? So would you get more fishery yield, let's say, in a system with a reserve and a fished area than if you were just fishing at that same level without the reserve there, right? And so in that context, we've shown with other modeling results, and other groups have shown this too, that the only way you get, whenever you put a reserve in, you can't fish there anymore. So you've lost fishing grounds. And so the only way you get a net increase, all else being equal, in fishery yield is if you were over harvesting, because then you have larvae being produced in the reserve going into the fished area when that area was already being over harvested, right? That's not to say, though, that in a system with a reserve and a perfectly sustainable fishery, there's still fish being produced in the reserve that migrate out and get caught, right? There's still spillover and still a benefit in that context. It's just not you're not increasing above what you would get if you were only interested in fishery yield. You would have the whole system managed sustainably, right? And so it's one of these things where there are other benefits of marine reserves. It's probably nice to have a place that you have lots of big fish, right? But it's not necessarily going to give you a benefit in terms of fishery yield better than what you would get by managing in a sustainable way. Yeah. I think Cheryl over here.
Thanks for a great talk. I'm interested in your current and future research, specifically as related to exploring the potential for dynamic marine reserve boundaries. And my question for you is, have you considered taking a transdisciplinary approach to that question? Because as someone from academia, relatively new to ODF and W, I am learning about the challenges of taking perhaps brilliant academic ideas and then translating them into reality. So I could imagine fishermen just being really upset at management changes that block their access to their favorite fishing grounds on very short time frames where they don't feel like they were consulted. To me, dynamic boundaries sounds great in theory, but when you think about enforcement and political backlash from the fishing community and all the uncertainty associated with anticipating heat waves, hypoxia, other disturbance events. So basically my question is, have you considered a transdisciplinary approach to include perspectives of fishermen and managers in coming up with feasible ways to manage this looming uncertainty with climate change?
Yes. Well, and I'm talking to your colleague about some of these, Mo sitting next to you there, about some of these ideas too. And so this work, the funding is mostly from California, and so the work is focused on California. And so we're collaborating with California Department of Fish and Wildlife to develop some of those potential, sorry, that's supposed to be on this slide there. To come up, we sort of asked them, like, what are the things you're thinking about doing with your fishery management and MPA network that you'd like us to explore? And so that's sort of how we've come up with our list of things that we're doing in that project. But you're right, and I think this sort of also gets to Maggie's question as well. One of the things that's not incorporated in the calculations, but you could imagine us doing that, is any effect on something economic, like fishery yield, needs to come with the discount rate, right? Like, so if there's going to be a benefit to fishery yield in 20 years, that's less valuable than a change in fishery yield right now, right? And so that discounting becomes really important when you're thinking about these long-term processes. The other thing in terms of, as we think about dynamic reserves, that's been proposed a lot, and my criticism has always been that it takes a lot longer to build up reserve effects because you have to wait for fish to get old than it does to take those away, right? We can fish down a system a lot better, a lot faster than it would build up again. And that really complicates the scenarios in which dynamic reserves are effective. But it would be great to talk more about your ideas.
Hello. It's kind of a detailed question, but I'm curious. You showed us the differential effects of spatial closures based on natural mortality. And we saw these different effects using time since implementation, but from your meta-analysis that had a pretty large spatial extent, I'm curious how, I guess, if you did any sort of like trait-based weighting or something where the year since implementation would have a different effect based on the community you're looking at.
Yeah, we did. This is one of these things where you write the paper a year ago and then by the time it's published, you've forgotten what's in it. We did look at a time effect, and there was not a big signal of time. And we think that is because, basically because it's so global, time since reserve gets all sorts of confounded with like the species that are involved and location and all those other things. And so, you know, although in general you'd expect to get a bigger effect after more time, but you'd also expect to get a bigger effect for shorter lived species. And I think those things get all jumbled up when you do that kind of analysis. So it's really hard to find. Where you do see that effect is, there's a really nice paper by Joachim Claudet that came out in 2010, where they did a similar analysis, but just on reserves in the Mediterranean. So it's basically all the same species assemblage, but different reserves. And there they saw a really strong effect of time since implementation.
One question, at the beginning of your presentation, you had some slides, I think, that showed the change in size and or biomass of fish in a model framework. And I was just wondering, can you expand on the kind of, the model framework that was used there? Like what kind of restrictions, or how was a MPA, defined in that model framework?
Yeah, so this is the same slide that the very first slide I showed just about is the same data. This is the one you're asking about, Mo?
No, it was, you just go through it.
We'll just redo the talk.
Well, not all of it.
Just stop me when I get to.
Yeah, those.
These guys.
One back. Yep. These, exactly.
Okay. So what are you asking me? Sorry.
How what was the model framework that like your variables that were like restricting your model?
Okay, so it was the age structured model. In this example, it's open recruitment. So we just had recruits coming in, and then it's just an age structured, no density dependence after the first age class. And it's age-based, but every age has an average biomass and length. And so we just added up however many there are, and that's your biomass. And we just ran it with no variability except for the one disturbance. So we reduced the number of recruits coming in by some proportion for some duration of time, and then just saw how long it took the population to rebound. right? So then the impact, you can tell how the impact was measured just by the distance from 1 down to however low it goes, and then return time was how long it took to get to like 95% of where you were before the disturbance. Oh boy.
Yes, some online questions. Go for it, Katie.
Okay. Did you look at the size and scale of a reserve being a factor, like bigger reserves providing more benefits, or alternatively, is there a minimum size that is needed to see benefits?
That's a great question. So I'm assuming that's a question from the meta-analysis part. And we didn't look at size as a covariate, and that's because the theoretical expectation is that the sort of minimum size or the effective size of the MPA depends on the scale of movement of the species. So if you have a species with a bigger home range, it would need a bigger MPA. And since we only sometimes had information on the area of the reserve and almost never had information on the movement scale or type of movement of the species we were looking at, we decided that wasn't an informative comparison.
Would it be beneficial to evaluate multiple reserves and understand by what factors biomasses and densities change based upon various spacing?
That sounds like an interesting question. When you're trying to find the effective spacing, it's really difficult because it's difficult to find replicates, essentially, of a system that has the same type of movement and connectivity with independent networks of reserves. That's a hard question to answer. I think that's something you could explore with models, and so we have some model analyses of how different levels of spacing lead to different outcomes. But I think that's an empirically hard thing to do in the field. Yeah.
The reserves depend on importance of local areas on outside areas. Other than in the overfished example, can non-reserves outside fishery populations affect, reduce, or alter reserves responses on other reserve species?
Yeah, so if I understand the question, I would say yes, because we typically understand all these systems to be interconnected, regardless of how much fishing is happening, that, fish spawn larvae that go everywhere. And so the fish part of the population is connected to the reserve part of the population. And so they're demographically linked. And yeah, regardless of what's happening outside the reserve, it's affecting what's happening in the reserve.
All right. Yeah, I think it's 4:30, so we should probably start wrapping things up.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, let's give it another hand.